All right, welcome to the study hall for January 24th. As you can see on the board, the topics for today are in sentence correction. There's a little bit more on overall sentence structure, and we're also going to treat a particular type of pronoun that appears in modifiers. So that is today. First, though, as usual, we got to look at some rules, the rules that govern all of these study halls. So if you're not new to this, then this will not be new to you either. But for those of you who are new, we do have to go over the rules of the study hall. So let's do that. Okay, problem submissions. We have a lot of stuff on the board here. Please don't submit problems that are too general or too specific. The basic idea, there's a lot of words on the board, but there's a basic idea that we need to have topics that we can actually use for a study hall. So topics that can actually last 60 to 90 minutes, meaning not more than that and not less than that. So, one problem that doesn't really tie into anything else isn't really a study hall topic, but something that constitutes half or all of the test isn't either. So keep that in mind when you submit topics. They need to be things that can actually be class units in a study hall. In terms of specific problems, if you do want to submit one problem, then that's what the forum is for. So if you have a single problem to submit, again, which does not tie into a more general question, please submit that on the forum. It's actually the dedicated place for such things. What we should see, again, is topics of intermediate depth that can last about 60 to 90 minutes. And if you submit specific problems, that's actually a good thing if you do. But please tie them into some sort of more general theme that you would want to see discussed in the study hall. So something like, I can't decide between C and D on this one question, but then could you please present this more general topic that it ties into? Finally, sources, please. We need them. We actually need them even if the problem is from us. So remember, we have something like 4,000 or 5,000 problems in our database at this point. So even if the problem is from Manhattan GMAT, you still have to please tell us what is the source. And the source cannot be the official guide by express request of the GMAT people themselves. So GMAT Prep is fine. The GMAT Prep software, that's actually the primary resource that we use, because it's free, and since it's free, it can be distributed freely, but as long as you attach the copyright notice at some point. But the official guide is not a free product, and as such, cannot be distributed for free. Okay. Some recent submissions that don't conform to the guidelines. These are not from the last couple of weeks. This is a slide from the previous one, but they're good illustrations. I mean, this person spent a lot of time typing this problem up, but this is just one problem, and it doesn't tie into any general question. So this is the kind of thing that should be posted on the forum. So please do if you have questions like that. This is an official guide problem. If you notice, when you actually log in to submit stuff, we will explicitly ask you not to do this. That doesn't stop some people from doing it anyway, but please don't. And then remember, personal questions, not great either. Remember what this is and isn't. Remember that this is a study hall whose recording is watched by hundreds, if not thousands, of people. So an individual study plan is not the best use of that time. So we do have a folder in the forum for this, as remarked on this other slide here. If you have personal questions about your study plan or about your own scores, then on the forum we have a general questions folder, which is for that kind of thing. And if you are specifically asking about applying to schools, then we have a partner firm called MBA Mission, which moderates an Ask an Admissions Consultant folder, also on the forum. So either way, the forum is the place to take questions like this. So there you go. It's pretty much what you have to do. Finally, please check the archives. This study hall has now been around for quite a long time. We've been doing it almost every other Thursday for the last 3 years or so, which means there's a lot of recordings at this point. I think there's about 80 recordings at this point. If not, it's at least in the 70s. But there are lots of them, is the point. So if you have a topic in mind, the odds are pretty good the topic has already been discussed in the study hall at some point. So if you have a topic in mind, please check the previous recordings and see if you can find the topic that you have in mind. And if you can find it, then watch the recording, see if your angle is treated, and if it is, everybody's happy. If not, if there's an angle of your topic that you don't see in that session or that you don't think has been treated, then please specify that when you submit the problem. Like, please actually say what the particular aspect or angle on that problem is that hasn't been treated yet. So those are the rules. If you guys understand. By the way, when we say give me a smiley face, so underneath your name, you should see some icons. So one of those icons should be a face icon that has all these emotional icons underneath it. So when we say give me a smiley face, we were talking about that. So if everybody understands those rules, go ahead and give me a smiley face, please. Okay, I'm seeing some smiley faces. That's a good thing. It would be nice to see a few more of them. A couple of people are giving me the applause. All right, so remember, give me a smiley face means this. What give me a smiley face does not mean is type a smiley face in the chat box. Because again, remember that there are lots of people here. There are about 30 of us live on most of these sessions. So if you type smiley faces into the chat box itself, then it'll devolve into chaos pretty quickly. So, but those smiley faces can appear all at the same time without much issues. Okay. As stated before, all of the problems on the following pages are from GMAT Prep, which is generally our go-to source for problems on here because it is official and it is free. So also remember that official guide problems cannot be distributed the same way. If these are warnings are redundant, I apologize, but again, copyright is sort of a big deal in this sphere. Also, when we give you a multiple choice question, what you should see underneath your name is you should see this letter A type of thing. That should take you to a multiple choice polling option where you can pick A, B, C, D, or E to a question. When you get a multiple choice question, this is where you should select the answer to that question. So please don't post it in the chat box. Thank you very much. And finally, I mean, you know, we can encourage people to do this, but ultimately it's up to you. You can't skip questions and you can't leave them blank. I mean, you can. There's nothing stopping you. But when you take the official test, you're not allowed to do that. So we strongly encourage you to simulate what the test is actually like by doing all the problems. And if you have to guess, then when time starts running out, you should guess. Okay, that's basically it. So we're going to jump into some problems here in a second. In case anybody is late, today's theme is this. More overall sentence structure and a certain type of pronouns within modifiers in sentence correction. And again, this is where you find your multiple choice answers. So give me the smiley face icon if you guys are ready to jump into some problems. All right, we're ready to do it. Okay, King, again, the smiley face icon is located here. It's not, please don't put it in the chat box. So you'll find it underneath your name. All right, let's jump into a problem. Right here. Here's a problem, and I'll put a timer on the board. This one's a little bit longer, so I'll put a timer with a little bit more time on it. Okay, and please remember where you will find things like multiple choice answers. Those are found here, underneath your name. This is where you find multiple choice answer options. Okay, give it a shot. Go. Okay, we still have a fair number of non-responders here, so please indicate, again, some sort of answer to this in the next, say, 10 or 15 seconds. And don't forget, this is where you find those answer options. Okay, let's go ahead and discuss. So here are your answers as a class. So we've got a plurality of answers favoring choice B here. It's not a majority, but it is more than for other choices. We've still got a handful of non-responders here, so again, please try to pick some sort of answer. Let's take a look, and remember the theme today is the overall structure of a sentence. So what that means, we've had a couple of previous units dealing with it, but again, this means, whether the sentence overall is actually a sentence. And then we're also going to look at a particular type of pronoun. But let's examine the overall structure of the sentence with an eye to whether we're looking at any things that are run-ons or fragments or just are not sentences in whatever way. So, and the best way to do that is to distinguish between modifiers and other units of the sentence. So, distinguishing between modifiers and other types of units. Because remember, when things are modifiers, they can be taken out of the grammatical context without changing much. Notice you can't just kill modifiers from the meaning of the sentence, but in terms of purely grammatical context, you can ignore modifiers and look at the rest of what surrounds. So, okay, in 1713, Alexander Pope began his translation of the Iliad. So notice that's already a complete sentence, just that much of it. In 1713, Alexander Pope, in 1713 is a modifier. Alexander Pope began his translation of the Iliad is already a complete sentence. So when we look at what follows, we should have modifiers. So modifiers that should work in the way that modifiers have to work. So if you look at A, let's take a look at these. So then let me type in the comment on the yellow part real quick. The yellow part is actually a complete sentence already. So what we need to look at then is how the modifiers are constructed in each part. So in A, we've got a work that taking him 7 years until completion, and that Samuel Johnson pronounced. In B, we've got a work that took him 7 years to complete, and that Samuel Johnson pronounced so-and-so. A work that had taken, and that Samuel Johnson pronounced it as. This is the pronoun that we mentioned at the beginning of the study hall here. And a work that took 7 years, and that Samuel Johnson pronounced it as something. And then a work that had taken 7 years to complete. And this, just Samuel Johnson pronounced it. So, okay, when we look at the modifier here in terms of construction, there are two of these that are problematic. There's a work that taking him, there's no verb in this part. So we have and Samuel Johnson pronounced. That part is fine, like a work that Samuel Johnson pronounced, whatever. But taking is not a verb. So that part of the structure, you can either see it as non-parallel, or you can notice that it results in an incomplete sentence. Because if you say a work that did something, it's got to be followed by a verb. Like you're making a clause when you do that. So there's no verb for taking, which has actually two sort of insidious results here. The first is that this clause isn't complete, but also there's nothing to be parallel to pronounced. So that's got issues. Any questions about choice A? Go ahead and type them in the text box. And then if you look at choice E, a work that had taken 7 years to complete, and instead of that Samuel Johnson pronounced, they wrote a separate clause here. So, I mean, this would be a complete sentence by itself. Literary critic Samuel Johnson pronounced it the greatest translation in any language. The red part would actually be its own sentence, which is exactly why it's a problem here. Because it's trying to be put in parallel to that had taken 7 years to complete. So you're taking something that is a modifier and trying to put it in parallel with something that is actually a sentence. So this is not a grammatically legitimate type of overall construction, and it's not parallel. So any questions about A or E there, go ahead and type them in the box. Now let's talk about the others. So if you look at the others in terms of the overall structure, they seem to be fine, because you have a work that took Pope however long to complete, and that Johnson pronounced some way. So Ash, can I explain what makes what not parallel? If you could, which choice and what do you not understand already about that? The verb in which choice? Well, I'm probably going to wind up mostly repeating what I just said, but I'll go ahead and take a crack at it here. In A here, you've got, in A, this construction all by itself, regardless of parallelism, is not a thing. Like, you can't say a work that doing something. I mean, if you write work that blah, 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 there has to be a verb there to follow it up. So like a work that was this, or a work that did something. So all by itself already, this is not a thing. And then pronounced is a verb. Taking is not. So things that are verbs are not parallel to things that are not verbs. And then in choice E, you have two elements that, well, the first of which is a modifier. The second of which is actually a complete sentence with its own subject and is not a modifier in any way. So those things are also definitely not parallel. So there's that. All right, so now let's look at B, C, and D. So let's take a look at this pronoun that exists in C and D and doesn't exist in B. That's this pronoun right here. So just for the sake of clarity, let's go ahead and import this onto the next page. So this. So you'll see the problem up here on your board again here in a moment. So let's take a look at this pronoun that appears in these two slots. So this is a pretty complicated sentence, which might make it a little bit harder to understand what's going on here. Let's give it a shot. So let's investigate this pronoun within modifiers. So what's the deal with that? And notice the overall construction in which this appears is a work that Samuel, if you start, if you ignore things that are further modifiers, a work that Samuel Johnson pronounced it as something. So as usual, it's easiest to investigate these kinds of things by looking at simpler versions of the same stuff. So here is a simpler version of the same thing that's going on here. A simpler quote, sentence, unquote. In quotes because it's actually not a legitimate sentence. If you say, the book that I read it yesterday was very exciting. So this is a problem. You can't do this because you got two pronouns that are trying to stand for the same thing here. So in other words, that is a special kind of pronoun that creates a modifier. But the point is the book that I read. So this word that here is already the pronoun in this construction. That means the book. So it's a modifier that describes book, but in terms of specifics, the word that is actually a pronoun that stands for this noun. So you don't include an it, since you already have that I read referring to the book. So the correct version of the sentence, again, this version here is not okay. The correct version of this sentence, well, a correct version of the sentence would be just without the it. So the book that I read yesterday was exciting. Because that I read yesterday, again, already refers to the book. And in general, if this is the object of that action, then that's how you write these constructions. You don't have another redundant pronoun. So, because this would mean the book that I read the book. The book that I read the book doesn't make any sense. The book that I read does. So If you don't have this kind of modifier construction, then you can have an it. You know, like, do you see that book on the table? I read it yesterday. Because now there's no that anymore. I mean, now you have an it in a standalone sentence that actually refers to the book. So if we look here, I mean, this is a much longer sentence with a lot more stuff going on, and there's another half of a parallel structure in the way. But the same thing is happening in choices C and D as is happening in this incorrect choice. I mean, you have the book that I read it. Like, in other words, the book that I read the book. It's not a construction. So these its have the same sort of issue as the it in that example down there. That makes C and D incorrect. B has no such issue, and so B is fine. And it turns out that B is the choice that we want here. Any questions about this? Go ahead and type them in the chat box, please. Also, if anybody is typing, just a quick comment while you guys do that. Notice, this is one thing that when I see forums and when I see people posting about sentence correction on the internet and so on, a lot of people don't have enough appreciation for simpler examples. Like, there are a lot of people who just like to dive into these super complicated examples. But where you're really going to learn this stuff is going to be in examples that are simpler. You know, because the challenge of all this is that everything is combined with a million other things. So if you do have trouble with one of these kinds of constructions, or if you're not real sure what's going on, you should try to consider sentences that isolate it. Okay, if you have any questions about this construction, what about the verb taking? Well, remember, taking is not a verb. Took versus had taken. So had taken also doesn't really work. Without digressing too much into a verb tense discussion, that's discussed in our 9-session course, but had taken, this tense requires some sort of impact on or relevance to another past time frame. So another later past time frame. So there's no such past time frame in this sentence, so you don't want to use had taken. Like, as an example of something that would be a past time frame like that, if you said, by the time I returned to the doctor's office, I had been taking the medicine for a month. Or by his 18th birthday, James had already beaten 2 grandmasters at chess. So in these 2 examples, you have another later time frame to serve as a reference. Here's the time frame here. Here's the time frame here. So then those earlier verbs could point to that later time frame. This sentence doesn't have anything like that. For more details on that tense, that's in the verb tense section of the 9-session course, and it's also in our sentence correction strategy guide under verbs. Okay, other things, I don't think anything else is, Jenny, I don't understand what you're asking. Wouldn't proposed to be? Oh, would the but it's remember, it's not just a random later thing. I mean, it has to be something to which the earlier verb is relevant or has some sort of impact or is like the end point of that verb. So like taking the medicine for a month, something that was ongoing up to the time that I went to the doctor's office. Here, you know, by his 18th birthday, this had already happened and was still a thing. He was still playing chess, and it was still relevant at that point. These are just two random historical events. So it took him 7 years, and this guy pronounced it the greatest translation in any language. But unless there is that sort of relevance or relationship, you don't use that tense. I don't really remember what it's called. But if you don't have this kind of relationship, you just use, like if you're just presenting two random past events, then just use the past for both. So, okay. If you can give a couple examples of that are simpler. So, for instance, if you say, I had already closed the registers and locked the doors when the customer showed up, versus I closed the registers and locked the doors before I went to get a snack. So, I mean, in this case, you have this relationship in the first one. I mean, meaning the customer showed up and arrived at a state where the registers and doors were closed and locked. I mean, that's the thing that affects the customer. So you have this sort of relevance here. There's no relevance. This is just something I did before I did something else with no bearing or impact on it. So you would just use the regular past tense for that. Lynn, the test has never tested will have whatever. So that's not a thing that, in a GMAT workshop, that's not a tense that's really worth discussing because the test has never tested it. But if you wanted information on that tense, you can always Google it on the internet. But until if and when they actually decide to test that, not really a thing. Okay, let's move on here. So let's look at another problem. No, this one's kind of tired. Go ahead and take a look at this one. So I'll clear out your answers, and again, here's where you get multiple choice options. Go ahead and give this one a shot. Okay, go ahead and pick an answer here if you haven't already. Looks like we got a pretty strong majority in this one, but there's still a couple of non-responders. Okay, so here are your responses as a group. We got a pretty overwhelming majority on this one, so we can probably go through this one more quickly. I mean, almost everybody is picking D here, so that's, yeah, if D were wrong, we would have an issue there, but let's go through this sort of quickly. So here, this is just a noun. That thing in commas is a modifier. So you have to have the rest of a sentence. So you need a verb. Was is a verb. And none of these other things are actually complete sentence structures. Like if you eliminate this modifier, then choice A winds up saying something like JJR is this person's name, Juan, or JRJ, Juan Ramon Jimenez, comma, modifier, comma, so embarrassed by something, comma, he destroyed. That's not a sentence. Because embarrassed is not a verb. Embarrassed is an adjective type modifier that describes JRJ. So overall, that's not a sentence. It's not. There's no subject-verb construction. You can't have this person, comma, he did this. Here, the word and is what gives you issues. You've got Juan Ramon Jimenez and was so embarrassed. So that's a parallel structure between things that are definitely not parallel. And it's not a sentence. It's not this person was embarrassed. It's this person and was embarrassed. That's not a thing. So B is not legit. C, JRJ in his later years. In his later years is a modifier, so we can knock that out of the sentence too. He was so embarrassed. Same problem as you got in B. Same problem as you got in A, actually. You've got subject, subject, verb. You can't say, my brother, he lives in San Francisco. You would just have to say, my brother lives in San Francisco. So same thing, you can't have Juan Ramon, he was so embarrassed. You can't have two subjects in a row like that. Here you actually have a subject and a verb. So everybody is happy. Then E, the overall sentence construction here is Juan Ramon because he was so embarrassed. Destroying. So here you got a couple of problems. The biggest problem is you don't have a verb. And because this because blah, 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 blah is another thing that you can remove from the main structure. So the main structure of the sentence here is just this person destroying. So it's basically just this person. Because destroying this stuff would be a modifier, and then because blah, blah, blah is separate construction. So there's no verb here. So this is a sentence fragment overall. So the only choice here that has a legitimate overall construction as a sentence is D. So again, you guys mostly nailed this thing. So we can probably move on. Difficulty level, if you've watched my previous study halls, you know what my answer to that is going to be. But the answer is there's no point in really ever thinking about that. Because when you take the official test, you will not have any idea what that is, and so thinking about it cannot help your strategy. So you're a lot better served by just thinking about what's in the problems and simplifying them down if necessary so you can examine their elements. But yeah, I mean, it's really all of this thinking about difficulty level is, people do it a lot, but it's not a thing that will help you. And it's a distraction that could definitely hurt you by taking brain power away from the stuff that matters. So the material, folks, the material is what you want to think about. Okay, any other questions about this? If not, we will move on to another example. Let's do that. Let me find another one. Okay. How about this one? All right. Try that. It's shorter, so I'll give you a little bit less time. Go for it. Okay, we still have some non-responders, so please pick something in the next few seconds if you haven't already. Okay, let's take a look. So here are the choices. So we've got some pretty healthy competition between these. So let's take a look at what's going on here. So the greatest road system built in the Americas prior to the arrival of Christopher Columbus. And this thing is about the Incan Highway. So let's take a look at the overall sentence structure of this thing. So choice A, I mean, this is just the greatest road system and then built in the Americas prior to the arrival of Christopher Columbus is a modifier. So in terms of discerning the overall structure of this thing, we can, the part in parentheses, we can disregard. So let's simplify. So choice A, in terms of overall structure, choice A says the greatest road system was the Incan Highway, comma, which over 2,500 miles long and extending. And then also this part is a modifier as well. So in terms of examining the overall structure, not really going to affect it. So this, well, you've got a problem here, right? Because the word which has to be followed by a verb. And there's no verb in the part that follows. So there's no verb that can have which as its subject. In this part, we are completely verbless. That's a problem, folks. This part right here. Because, you know, think about simple examples that use the word which. Like, this is my garage, comma, which holds 2 cars, period. You have to have a verb, which holds 2 cars, which verbs something. So, no verb there, that's an issue. So A overall is not a sentence. overall structure of B is the greatest road system was the Incan Highway and extended. So, I mean, that actually overall, in terms of overall sentence structure, grammar, that is a sentence. This was this and that. Like you would have the verb was this and the verb that. And those are interesting things to put in parallel, which we'll get back to. But at least in terms of overall sentence structure, it's actually a sentence. Choice C, the greatest road system, comma, the Incan Highway, comma, which was however long it was and extended however far that it extended. So this is not a sentence because you have a subject but you don't have a verb. Like you've got, this would be a subject. Actually, the greatest road system would be the grammatical subject here. And then the Incan Highway would just be a modifier specifying what that exactly was. But the point is there's no verb here. You just have subject, modifier, other modifier. Which was, you cannot have an entire sentence where your verb is which was. Again, if you don't see the issue with this, a lot of people pick this choice. So if you don't see the issue with this choice, the best way to see the issue is to compare it to a much simpler example. This is kind of like my brother, Jesse, who lives in San Francisco. That's not a sentence. I mean, you could say my brother Jesse lives in San Francisco. But you can't just say my brother who lives in San Francisco, because then you're still waiting for a verb. Like you're still waiting for me to actually tell you what my brother does. So, how someone says, how about built as a verb? Janine, I don't see the word built in this problem, so I'm not sure what you're asking about. Choice D, you can elaborate on that, please. Choice D. And by the way, when you guys evaluate these things, this is what you should do. I mean, if you're not sure how the overall sentence structure works here, the worst thing you can do is sit there and keep staring at the current example. I mean, the best thing to do is to make some sort of analogy between it and a simpler construction. That's how you achieve that sort of understanding here. The greatest road system built. Okay, we'll get there. That's not a verb. This is a modifier describing the road system, but we'll get there. D says the greatest road system, comma, the Incan Highway, being over 2,500 miles in length, was extended. So in terms of overall sentence structure, that is actually a sentence. That is a thing. Because you do have the greatest road system was. So there are issues there, but at least in terms of overall sentence structure, it's actually a complete sentence. And then choice E, we've got the greatest road system, comma, the IH was, comma, and then you have this modifier extending wherever it extended. So this is constructed so that this is the subject. This is an this is an introductory modifier, this part here. So that's an introductory modifier. And then you have this comma plus ing type of modifier that tells you a little bit more about the preceding description. So let's take a look. But that's actually a sentence as well. So the two of these that are not actually sentences are A and C. So again, C was actually a fairly popular choice here. So this is a pretty standard non-sentence that you'll see on a lot of these. I mean, you just have a subject followed by which. So if you, make sure, a good 1/3 of everybody here picked C. So just make sure that you realize why that is not a sentence. So now let's take a look at the other stuff that's in B and D and E. So here's the problem again on a fresh slide. You'll see it pop up in just a second if you don't already see it. So let's take a look at B, D, and E as independent things here, now that we've analyzed their structure overall. Okay, so B, before we do this, remember that the meaning of the sentence is the point. So what's the intended message of the sentence? So first of all, the focus of the sentence is the Incan Highway. The sentence is meant to describe, to tell us more about the Incan Highway. In particular, it's meant to tell us that that was the greatest road system built in whatever time period. And then also, it extended all the way from Ecuador to the bottom of Chile, all the way from point A to point B, wherever those are. And that's a distance of over 2,500 miles. Now, when you talk about parallel structures, you want to make sure that you understand what kinds of things are supposed to be parallel structures and what kinds of things are not supposed to be parallel structures. So, like for instance, A has other problems as well, but these are not appropriate parallel structures because this and this are the same observation. They're not different. So remember that parallel structures are supposed to be related observations but different from each other. So basically parallel structures should make sense as bullet points. So for instance, anything that is a parallel structure at all, like here's a really simple example of this. Like if you say, I like swimming and running. I like swimming and lifting weights. So that in terms of bullet points, you could actually make bullet points for swimming and lifting weights. So, and that helps you understand why that's actually a legitimate parallel structure. I like swimming, bullet point number 1, and I like lifting weights, bullet point number 2. So I mean, anything that doesn't make sense naturally organized into bullet points like this is something that should not be a parallel structure. So the problem with B is that you've got this parallel structure that doesn't make sense as a parallel structure, and you've got things that are supposed to be descriptions of other things that aren't written that way. Like choice B, if you make this, because you have a parallel structure in choice B. I mean, here's your and. So B is presenting the information like this. It's the greatest road system is the subject of that construction. And then you've got bullet point number 1 is, was the Aiken Highway, which was over 2,500 miles long. And second bullet point, extended from point A to point B. I mean, these things, there's two issues here. I mean, the first is that was the Aiken Highway and extended this far. Those are not things that make sense in parallel. Because one of those is the name of the road system, and one of those is where it went. I mean, these are totally separate kinds of things that don't make sense as parallel structures. So that's the first issue there. The second issue is that the fact that it goes from point A to point B, that is the 2,500 mile distance. And choice B doesn't convey that information. In fact, you've got the 2,500 miles in this part. Then you have and so extended from here to here is presented as though it were a completely separate piece of information. So there's two issues there. The first is that you have things in parallel that don't make sense as parallel structures. They don't make sense as bullet points. But the other thing is that you have something that's supposed to be a description of something else and doesn't appear that way. Like the 2,500 miles doesn't appear as a description of the distance from point A to point B, or vice versa. Versus, let's skip down to E, which is actually what we want here. So let's analyze that and talk about why it does make sense. There's no parallel structures in E. The greatest road system, comma, the Aiken Highway was over 2,500 miles long, extending from point A to point B. So let's move that down a little bit. It's getting crowded. Okay, so let's take a look. So here you've got a modifier. You can have modifiers that take this form where it's another noun describing a noun. So that's legit. But let's focus our attention on this modifier construction here, which makes a lot more sense than what's in B. Like comma extending. There's more detail on this in the modifiers part of the strategy guide and also in the 9-session course where session 6 they cover modifiers. But the short version is that comma plus ing when it comes after a sentence like that should describe in some sort of way or should give some sort of modifying or describing aspect of the previous action. So the previous, which is was, is not really an action, but it should describe the previous clause. In other words, the subject plus verb pair. So this should be telling us more about the Aiken Highway was 2,500 miles long, and in fact, that's precisely what it does. This is a very good construction because it tells us more. It tells us more about the 2,500 mile stretch of highway. In particular, that 2,500 mile stretch is from point A to point B. So, and then choice D, nobody picked it, so we probably don't have to spend as long talking about it. So, but choice D is the greatest road system. I mean, I have a feeling some people might have just not picked this because it said being. I mean, remember, I mean, you don't, it's true that you don't want to start modifiers with being, but make sure that you also understand what's wrong here on another level. So the greatest road system, the IH comma being over 2,500 miles long was extended. So, okay, the first problem is, I mean, yes, you starting a modifier with being is sort of sketchy. That is true. On the other hand, the word being in general is not a problem. In fact, there are several official problems in which being is a perfectly acceptable construction. But starting a modifier with being is generally not okay. Because with modifiers, if you have the word being, you can usually just write the modifier without it. So you could just say over 2,500 miles wrong. But just for the sake of completeness, if you have the word being in a situation that's not a modifier, then it's generally okay. So if you say, like, being as a noun type construction, as an action noun, is okay. So if you say something like being shot is very painful, like actually getting a bullet in your body, being shot. Also, the other case in which this is okay even as a modifier is if you are describing something that is actually happening right now. So you can start a modifier with this word being if you are actually describing something that is happening to someone right at this exact moment, or at the moment in which the sentence took place. So if you mean something ongoing in the actual time frame of the sentence. So, for example, if you say the model being photographed outside is my wife. I mean, if this is what's happening right now, like if the pictures are being taken while the sentence is stated or written or whatever, because what is she doing right now? She is being photographed. I mean, in this case, you can't just write the model photographed outside, because that sounds like she already was photographed. So, but if it's ongoing, then you would actually have to write it as the model being photographed outside. But otherwise, this is clearly not happening here. And this is not an action that is happening to the highway in the context of the sentence, so it's not okay. And then the other problem with this choice is that it was extended. I mean, by itself, that would be okay. I mean, that would mean that they just made it longer. So, but the problem is that clashes with what's in the rest of the sentence. It doesn't work in context. Like if you, because again, we're giving a static length of this highway. We're saying, you know, it was 2,500 miles long. So was extended would have to come in a different context. It would have to come in the context of something like after it was extended, it was this long. or before it was extended, it was however long. But right now there's no clear context of what's the relationship between this length and this extension. Those things are not. Those things don't have a clear relationship to each other. So this doesn't work either. All right, one more question someone had about built. Let me just put that up there. So when you have this sort of thing, again, here's the question again. So someone asks, what about built as a verb? I mean, the problem here is that built is not a verb. So it's a modifier that describes the road system. I mean, as far as how do you know that, it's just context. I mean, because most of these types of modifiers could be either verbs or not, depending on how they're written. But it's going to be pretty obvious from context when it's a verb and when it's not. Like so the greatest road system built in the Americas versus something like the native peoples of South America built a road system. So, I mean, the difference here should be pretty clear. I mean, these people actually built something. So the native peoples built a road system. Like, they did that. From context, that's clear. So that would be actually a subject. The native peoples. And then that's a verb. And then that's what they built. Versus this is not a subject and a verb, because clearly a road system did not build anything. So that describes a road system, but the road system didn't do that, which again should be obvious from context. So this is a noun, and then this is something that describes or modifies that noun. Modifier describing that noun. So yeah, I mean, you're right that there are words that, I mean, the word built can be a verb. But again, at the end of the day, you have to develop at least some sort of rudimentary understanding of what the sentence is actually trying to tell you before you're crazy with grammar analysis. All right, let's move on to, let's see if we can hit at least one more here, and then we will see where we're at. So here's another problem. I'm going to kill your multiple choices. And here is the problem. Again, here's where you will find multiple choice answers. Please use those options. And here is a timer. Okay, have fun. Okay, we still have quite a few non-responses here, so please pick something in the next 10 or 15 seconds. Okay, so again, I think we are pretty happy with this one. But here are your responses. So there's a majority in favor of C here. Pretty nicely done. Let's take a look and go from there. So this is an introductory modifier, this thing that's right here, rivaling the pyramids of Egypt or even the ancient cities of the Maya. And then you have the sentence, which is the army of these things. Lots of modifiers here. Of terracotta warriors describes the army. So does created to protect, QSH. Not real sure how to pronounce that. But then this is another modifier. China's first emperor describes QSH. And then in his afterlife describes protecting QSH. So you have the army is blah, 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 blah. So you have a parallel structure where it is more than 2,000 years old and took a lot of people a really long time. So let's take a look at that parallel structure first. So if you take a look at that, you have two facts about the army. And again, remember that the best way to tell whether parallel structures make sense is that parallel structures should be sensible if you express them as bullet points. So let's do that. Well, the army of terracotta warriors. Well, bullet point number one, it is over 2,000 years old. And bullet point number two, took lots of people a really long time to make. So these are the two things that should be expressed in parallel structures. Like it's two facts about this army. The army is really old, and the army took a lot of people a really long time. So this is parallel in that respect. So is this. So is this. On the other hand, this is a complete sentence. So, or at least it has a clause. It has a subject and a verb. So this is not parallel to anything that comes earlier. So, and then to complete them took these artisans more than 36 years. That's also actually a complete sentence. So that's not parallel to anything either. So in terms of parallel structures, you are down to just three choices. So well, let me take a look at our previous discussion of that kind of pronoun. So here that type of pronoun again. Let me find our previous discussion of that. Paste here. So here is what we looked at with that pronoun before. A simple sentence that I read as well as I cited. So that'll reason just in a moment. Okay, so remember how this kind of pronoun works. If you have something that already you have a that, or you have. This is not the same construction structure because you don't have that. But let's make an analogy to the existing sentence and then the examples. If you wrote the book is very hard to read it, that doesn't make sense. Because this is the book is very hard to read. You can't say the book is very hard to read the book. So that's incorrect. For the same reason, there's no that here, but I think you can see the issue here. You already have the book, so this is a construction that doesn't make any sense the way it's written. It's similar to this, except for you don't have the problem with that. You just have the problem with this thing as the subject and then having it again here. So the way that you would fix that is the book is very hard to read. So very hard for me to read. The book is very hard to read, or the book is very hard for me to read. This is a sentence that actually makes sense. So, well, let's take a look at what we've got. Here, the army took lots of people a really long time to make. Not to make it. This is the same kind of construction as the book is very hard to read. So the book is hard to read, not the book is hard to read it. So the army took lots of people a really long time to make, not to make it. So this doesn't make sense. And then for them, the them could theoretically be the terracotta warriors, but again, you still have this problem. You still have the army took a very long time for people to make the army. Still not a legitimate construction. You can either say it took a long time for them to make it, or like it took a long time for them to make the army. Or the army took them a long time to make. So, but not both. You can't have nouns in both places or pronouns in both places that talk about the same thing. So you've still got that issue in A as well. And then D and E are not legitimately parallel structures. That leaves C. Okay. That about does it for that problem. I see some things in the box. Is the voice still a problem? Okay. For some reason my chat box didn't update. Did you guys... Okay, I don't know how long the echo lasted, but probably some sort of internet connection issue. If you guys have any questions, I don't know which part of the previous discussion, if anything, was hard to catch there, but if anything was unclear, go ahead and type a question in the chat box. And otherwise, we are just about done for the day. So I'll see if you guys have any questions about this. And if not, we will start wrapping up. Okay, a couple people are typing. So I'll see what you guys have to say. You're welcome. Could I go back to build? So there's that. Right, where was that? That was here. Okay. If you have a question about that, I mean, this is about what I had to say about that. So if anything here is not clear, then go ahead and ask a question. While you think about that, let's revisit this problem right here. So this is a misunderstanding of the meaning of the sentence. I mean, the army was not trying to complete anything. Like the artisans took a long time to complete the army. I mean, again, that should be clear already when you first read the sentence. Like, remember, when you guys read these sentences, that's the first thing you've got to do. You've got to say, what is the meaning of the sentence? That you should always be able to tell by combining the words that are there with common sense. I mean, the army obviously can't complete anything because it's, made of wax or whatever. But the artisans made the army, and they took a really long time to do it, about 36 years. Like, same thing, the book is hard for me to read. I mean, the book is not reading anything. I mean, I'm reading the book. So same sort of thing. The army was hard for me to complete. If I made it myself, then it was hard for me to do this. I mean, the army didn't complete anything. I did. So I hope that helps. Here is the... if you had any question about built, Janine, I'm not sure what... But I could think of it as the greatest road system built was. I mean, even then, this is still this is still not a verb. Like even if you thought of it this way, the greatest road system ever built was the IH. This is still the same sort of construction. I mean, this is still a noun, and this is still something that describes it. So that's the same type of construction we were looking at before. So if that's what you're asking, then that's the same sort of thing. That's still a noun, and that's still a modifier that describes it. Okay. What? IAME, or however you pronounce that, I'm not sure that that's technically called, I'm not sure that you would technically call that passive voice, but that's not what's important here. What's important is that you understand the way the construction works. I mean, I have no idea how you would grammatically classify any of this. I have no idea at all, but it's still a thing. It's still a construction that is very common in the language. So, and I mean, this is one thing that holds a lot of people back. I mean, if you are too concerned with trying to classify everything in the world, then you're pretty much going to find every one of these sentences like incredibly intimidating and hard unless they're like really simple and short. The way to learn this is not classifying everything in the world. The way to learn this is the same way that you learned your first language as a kid, which is to accumulate a bunch of examples in your head of what works and what doesn't, and then to be able to use those as a reference point for further examples. Not to try to, break everything down and use 10,000 rules. So you'll see that. If you think in terms of canonical examples like this one, then you'll find everything much easier. Because it's not hard to see the analogy between this and that. Whereas trying to classify it, again, I have no idea how you would classify any of this stuff. But you can just see that this works like that. So it's a different way of thinking. It's a very fundamental shift in how you should think about this stuff, but it's important. Okay, we're going to close up shop here. Thank you for attending. And the next one is, I believe, in 2 weeks, but you should check the Thursday Study Hall webpage, just to be sure. Again, thank you. Good night and good luck.